Kyle Salterian appears in the virtual reality game Fantasy Defense as the youngest son of the prestigious Salterian Marquis family. He was one of the Salterian family members involved in major early game events, but during an encounter with the main character, Kyle is beaten badly and ends up dying pitifully after just one blow from a minion summoned by a villain. This marked him as an extra character, and that extra is now our protagonist. Pinching his cheek hard, Kyle felt a sharp pain, realizing that this was not a dream. He stared at himself in the mirror and, bewildered, shouted, wondering how he had possessed such a worthless character when he was supposed to be Lee Hyun-woo, the top-ranked player in the world of Fantasy Defense. Fantasy Defense is a fantasy-themed defense game that became a huge global hit in 2030. The game is known for its devilishly high difficulty level, and even after 10 years, no one has managed to clear it. Despite this, its addictive nature and challenging mechanics kept it incredibly popular. Players earned points in global rankings based on how they played in completed quests, with rare quests and items significantly boosting their scores. For 10 real-life years, Lee Hyun-woo had been completely immersed in the game, mastering everything from rare magic circles to legendary crafting combinations. With an overwhelming score, he became a living legend as the top-ranked global player. But now, having possessed an extra character, he was left wondering how he could possibly survive in this world when even the protagonist, equipped with the best talents, couldn't clear the game. He vividly remembered Kyle Salterian's fate because he had played the game so many times. The ultimate goal in Fantasy Defense was to stop the forces of darkness, and the one who summoned these dark forces was none other than the second son of the Salterian family, Adel. Seeking to usurp the head of the family, Adel turned to dark powers, instigating a rebellion. In the end, the Salterian territory became a stronghold for the dark forces, who had long coveted the human lands. Amidst the chaos, the powerless Kyle was easily killed. Lying on the bed, Kyle thought he could simply leave the territory before the rebellion started. However, he knew there was a bigger problem. Kyle had a disease known as hermimu. Hermimu is a condition where the mana channels within the body are blocked. In this world, mana is the source of both aura and magic, and it provides essential energy for survival. Those with blocked mana channels, like hermimu patients, cannot absorb the necessary nutrients for life and growth, and most die before they reach 20. Kyle knew that the only cure for hermimu was to absorb nature into the body. However, since his mana channels were blocked, this was impossible. In other words, being diagnosed with hermimu was akin to receiving a death sentence. Diagnosed at a young age, Kyle had fallen into despair, overwhelmed by the fear of death, the anxiety about his remaining time, and the frustration of his inability to fight back. Eventually, he became twisted, and before long, Kyle had turned into a disgrace to the family. In the end, his father, the head of the Salterian family, confined him to an annex. Furious, Kyle shouted that they must think he was a joke for looking down on him. In a fit of rage, he grabbed something nearby and hurled a chair against the wall, yelling for everyone to just die already, making it clear that Kyle was beyond hope. Even in the game, Lee Hyun-woo had seen Kyle as a lost cause. He looked around his room, thinking that Kyle was so rotten that even his terminal illness didn't stir any sympathy. He decided to reassess the situation and found himself puzzled at the man he had possessed. Kyle, the youngest son of the Marquis, but from a doomed family. Kyle had no talent in swordsmanship or magic, no life expectancy, a terrible personality, the worst reputation, and was confined by the head of the family. At that moment, he realized that he was truly doomed. Whether he stayed or ran, he would die, trapped in a no-win situation. In frustration, he shouted, "How am I supposed to survive in this world with such terrible stats? Isn't it normal to get some kind of cheat ability when you're reincarnated, like a status window or something?" Suddenly, a light appeared behind him. When he looked back, he saw glowing circles floating in the air. Confused, he reached out to one of them, wondering what they were since he had never seen anything like this before. As soon as he touched one, it exploded, releasing a bright light, leaving him wondering what was happening. Out of nowhere, a system message appeared, showing that he had awakened. He had been granted 2 new talents, the status window was unlocked, and he could now use insight, which would activate automatically. He was shocked to see the status window appear and excitedly examined it. He noticed that one of the talents he was granted was mana pathways. While he knew the insight talent allowed him to see detailed specs, he had never encountered mana pathways before. Puzzled, he thought that, judging by the name, it must be related to magic. He recalled that the best magic talent was supposed to be Mana Companion, but his intuition told him this was something even more extraordinary. He felt it was a top-tier talent and began to believe that he wouldn't be stopped now. He touched another floating circle, which entered through his hand and goes to his veins. He was shocked, feeling the energy coursing inside him. Suddenly his hands snap, and when he looks at it, he saw the Hermamum blocking the mana pathway. He then commanded the mana to move according to his will. Closing his eyes, he ordered it to pierce through the Hermamu. The mana responded to his will, and when he shaped it into a drill, it followed his command and began piercing the blockage in his body. He continued directing it until it successfully broke through the Hermamu. Excited, he saw that it worked, the mana was flowing. Though it had only reached up to his elbow, he knew that by continuing to gather mana and open the channels, he could overcome Hermamu's barrier. He felt a surge of relief, realizing that he wouldn't die. The next day, in the kitchen, a maid was preparing a dish and felt pleased that she had finished. She picked it up, thinking she should take it to Kyle quickly before it got cold. However, a group of other maids appeared and ordered her not to deliver the meal to Lord Kyle. She stared at them, confused, as they glared back at her. One of the maids, Hi, explained that they had decided to stop serving Kyle for a while as a protest against his behavior. She added that after going hungry for a few days, Kyle might change his attitude. And she instructed the maid to put the dish down. The other maids agreed with her. Despite their orders, the maid calmly responded, to do whatever they want. And she'll do her job. Hai was enraged by her defiance and asked if she thought she was the only one acting all noble. Without warning, Hai slapped the tray out of her hands. And the maid stared in surprise as the food scattered across the floor. Hai, still fuming, demanded to know if the maid still thought she was a noble, mocking her for being sold as a slave. After her family's downfall, the maid stayed silent, quietly picking up the tray from the ground while Hai shouted at her not to be so arrogant. Ignoring the outburst, she continued gathering the dishes, which only made Hai angrier. Hai raised her hand to slap the maid, demanding to know if she was going to keep ignoring them. But fortunately, a man entered the kitchen just in time. He loudly asked what all the commotion was about. The maids were shocked to see him. It was Leonhardt. One of the other maids asked why Leonhardt was in the kitchen. But he ignored the question and noticed the meal on the ground. Realizing it was meant for Kyle, and that the other maids were causing trouble, he told the maid to prepare the meal again and take it to Kyle quickly. Surprised by his order, she replied with a simple yes, while the 2 other maids stood aside. She rushed back to the preparations as Leonhardt quietly observed her. Meanwhile, in Kyle's room, he was examining his talents, insight and mana pathways. He thought that by using these 2 talents, he might be able to change the fate of the fallen Sulturian family. Having played fantasy defense for 10 years, he possessed information that almost felt like foresight. On top of that, he was born into a family with great power and wealth like the Sulturians. This meant it wasn't impossible to block the forces of darkness. He then made up his mind to take action and decided to focus on 3 main tasks. First, he would clear the mana channels and overcome Hermamu's barrier. Second, he would learn magic, since mana pathways was specialized in magic, it made more sense to become a mage rather than a knight. Second, he needed to prevent the downfall of the Salterian Marquis family. The better the family did, the better off he would be. The Salterian Marquis family was strong in reputation, skill, and wealth, an important shield for him. Since their territory was on the outskirts, he didn't need to worry too much about the capital's politics. Third, and most importantly, he needed to gather talents to prepare for the Dark Force's major assault in the coming years. He would need strong allies. Using his insight talent, he decided to select people with potential and make them his so they could become reliable forces. Confident, he thought that by building strength, he would definitely survive. To gather talent, he should start by looking close by. And since he was in the Salterian Marquis family, Leonhardt would be a good place to start, as he was a useful tank and PC in the game. Just then, there was a knock on his door. A maid entered inside and informed him that she had brought his meal. Surprised, he tried to recall a faint memory of her, wondering what her name was. As he was thinking, the system suddenly popped up, showing that his insight talent had been activated. The system informed him that the target was of a low rank, and a status window appeared in front of him. He realized that with insight, he could now see other people's information. He saw that her name was Ursel, 12 years old, with a talent called Eternal Friend of Spirits. Her traits were listed as cool-headed and diligent, and her affection level was 30. He was shocked to see her talent and focused on it. Eternal Friend of Spirits was a top-tier spirit summoning talent. Without realizing it, he had moved quite close to her and only snapped out of it when she looked at him. She politely told him to enjoy his meal, to which he responded with a simple yes. As she walked away, he wondered how someone with the talent to become a genius spirit summoner was working as a maid in such a place. A year ago, at an auction, the host greeted the audience, promising them something special. An item they wouldn't easily find elsewhere, something they had barely managed to acquire. Kyle was among the audience. The host then presented a girl, introducing her as the third daughter of the fallen Baron Helheim family, Ursel. The audience was surprised, while the host emphasized her well-mannered and smart nature, despite her fallen noble status, and invited them to start bidding. The bidding began at 50 gold, quickly rising to 70, then 90. Next to Kyle was Leonhardt, who urged him to leave, commenting that slave auctions weren't worth their time. However, Kyle raised his hand and made an offer of 300 gold for Ursel, shocking both Leonhardt and the host. The host, wide-eyed, announced the bid, asking if anyone wished to bid higher. Leonhardt, taken aback, asked Kyle if he really intended to buy a slave and what his father would think of it. But Kyle, irritated, shouted at Leonhardt to stop nagging him, saying he could spend his money however he wanted and that his father didn't care about what he did. As the host declared Ursel sold for 300 gold, Kyle rushed to the stage, removing his mask. Leaning closer to her, he told her firmly, "From now on, you belong to me." After leaving the auction, Kyle freed Ursel from her chains, telling her she was no longer a slave. She could go wherever she wanted now. Ursel, surprised by his words, hesitated. As Kyle turned to leave, she was confused about where she should go and reminded him that he had just said she belonged to him. This caught Kyle off guard. She rushed forward, grabbing his coat and declared that she would follow him. Kyle stared at her for a moment, sighed, and told her to do as she pleased. Reflecting on the memory of how Kyle had met Ursel, he realized it was one of Kyle's memories. He figured out that Ursel had become a maid in the Marquis family because Kyle had taken her in after rescuing her from being sold as a slave, following the downfall of her family. This realization made him see how much Ursel had endured at such a young age. He also noticed that he had fully merged with Kyle, even feeling the emotions Kyle had toward her, the shared sense of abandonment and powerlessness against fate. He was snapped back to the present when he tasted the food Ursel had brought. Surprised by how good it was, he asked her if she had made it herself. Ursel, startled, rushed back in to check if something was wrong. Kyle reassured her that the food was delicious and praised her cooking skills, even requesting that she prepare it for him again in the future. Though surprised by the compliment, she agreed. Shortly after, the system showed that her affection toward him had increased to 35. He considered that, given the dramatic circumstances in which Kyle and Ursel had met, it wasn't a particularly high affection score. However, considering Kyle's past delinquent behavior, it was a miracle she had any affection for him at all. He recalled that in fantasy defense, there was no NPC named Ursel with the talent for spirit magic. This led him to believe that she must have died during the internal rebellion within the Marquis family before her abilities could develop. Determined not to let such a valuable talent go to waste, he swore that this time, things would be different. Kyle then asked Ursel if she had ever thought about learning spirit magic. She was stunned as she had never considered that she might have any talent for it. From this reaction, Kyle realized that she likely hadn't encountered spirit magic, even in her own home. Spirit magic was known to be particularly expensive to learn, something a lower-ranked noble family like hers could not afford. Kyle decided to take charge of her training and told her to start thinking about learning spirit magic. Despite her initial reluctance, he made it clear that there was no option to refuse. He approached her and explained that she needed to follow his words, as she was now his responsibility. Ursel, stunned by his seriousness, stared at him for a moment before blushing in shyness. The system indicated that her affection for him had increased to 50, and she ultimately agreed to follow his instructions. A few days later, Kyle faced off against Leonhardt when he attempted to leave his room. He demanded Leonhardt step aside as he intended to go outside. Leonhardt calmly refused, informing Kyle that he could not leave without the master's permission. Kyle's frustration boiled over and he lashed out, questioning whether he was expected to remain locked up forever. Leonhardt, remaining composed, reminded Kyle of the master's orders, asking if he had forgotten the reason for his confinement. The sharp reminder triggered a wave of fear as Kyle recalled that, due to his delinquent behavior, the Marquis of Saltarion had confined him to his room. However, Kyle knew he didn't have much time left, and as he glanced around, he saw the mana particles floating in the air of his room. Realizing he needed to act soon, since discovering that he could open his mana channels, Kyle had been absorbing the mana in his room every day. Although it wasn't enough to open the channels all at once like it had on the first day, the mana gradually accumulated in his body, like experience points in a game. His physical condition improved over time, but it still wasn't enough to fully cure Hermimu. This meant he needed to go outside to gather more mana. Smiling, he told Leonhardt that he wasn't going far, just for a short walk to get some exercise. Leonhardt, surprised by the reasoning, remarked that it was the first time Kyle had ever given such a constructive explanation. This irritated Kyle, who demanded to know what Leonhardt took him for. Leonhardt replied that, as Kyle's bodyguard for years, it was the first time he'd heard him say anything like that. Kyle realized that his reputation had been so terrible for so long that his trust level was essentially zero. He wondered who would have thought that Leonhardt, of all people, would be such an impenetrable wall. It seemed reasoning with him was nearly impossible. Leonhardt was currently Kyle Saltirion's bodyguard, but in fantasy defense, he was a highly famous character with excellent skills in both defense and offense, and immense potential. Leonhardt could be developed into a captain-level knight and was often used as a tank in parties. Players loved him for his loyalty trait, which ensured he would never betray them. In the original game, after the downfall of the Marquis family, Leonhardt became a wandering knight and could be recruited by the player. However, since the Second Son's rebellion hadn't happened yet, Leonhardt was still stationed at the Salterian mansion. Kyle couldn't believe that such a talented individual was being wasted as a mere babysitter for a delinquent like him. He wondered what the Salterian Night Order was even doing. He then asked Leonhardt why he was still there, which surprised Leonhardt and angered him. Leonhardt seriously asked if Kyle had a problem with him being his bodyguard. Kyle panicked when he saw that Leonhardt's affection toward him dropped by 60 points. Hastily, Kyle explained that he didn't have a problem with Leonhardt personally. But he couldn't bring himself to admit that Leonhardt was too talented for such a mundane job. Leonhardt responded that he was simply following the master's orders. This made Kyle snap and realize that Leonhardt's loyalty wasn't to him, but to his father, Remton Salterian. Kyle smirked at the thought, wondering who would want to be loyal to a delinquent like him. Still, he knew he couldn't let the situation continue as it was. He told Leonhardt that he needed to convince his father. Leonhardt noticed something different about Kyle's demeanor and Kyle smiled, thinking that once he caught Leonhardt's attention, he could win him over. He asked Leonhardt if he was right to assume that he would agree, silently thinking that his second project for recruiting talent was now Leonhardt. Leonhardt noticed something different about Kyle's attitude and asked what he was scheming. Kyle responded by asking what he meant by scheming, but he quickly realized that Leonhardt didn't trust him at all. He then explained that he had been in his room for so long that his thoughts had changed. When Leonhardt asked what he meant by that, Kyle smiled and replied that he had decided he wanted to live a long life. Leonhardt was stunned, unable to believe that Kyle, someone who had given up on everything due to his incurable hermeneutic disease, now had a desire to live longer. Months earlier, Remton had confided in Leonhardt, telling him that Kyle likely wouldn't live past the age of 20. Not only did Kyle lack magical talent, but he was also unskilled in swordsmanship. Being the youngest meant he had no chance of inheriting the family title. Despite all this, Remton insisted that Leonhardt stay by Kyle's side. Remton had asked if Leonhardt resented him for this decision. But after a brief pause, Leonhardt had replied that it was an honor beyond words for anyone in the Salterian Night Order to protect a direct descendant of the Marquis family, and that he would faithfully fulfill his duties. Remton, seeing Leonhardt's loyalty, explained that there was no one else in the Marquis household he trusted more to protect Kyle. He begged Leonhardt to take care of his son, and after some hesitation, Leonhardt bowed and agreed. Now, hearing Kyle speak about wanting to live longer and asking for permission to exercise outside left Leonhardt in shock. Kyle suggested that Leonhardt tell his father, confident that Remton would understand. He then asked Leonhardt if it would be acceptable for him to go outside. However, Leonhardt moved his hand to the side, blocking Kyle's path, and firmly told him that he could exercise indoors as well. Kyle, growing frustrated, scratched his head, realizing that Leonhardt was truly stubborn. Rather than continuing to ask politely, Kyle shifted his tone and ordered Leonhardt to move aside, making it clear he didn't want to repeat himself. He released a bit of his aura, knowing that he needed to go outside to gather more mana cores. Kyle stared directly into Leonhardt's eyes, letting his aura press forward. Leonhardt could feel that something was indeed different about Kyle, but even so, he couldn't back down. Leonhardt stepped closer, releasing his own powerful aura, reminding Kyle that his father's orders were absolute and applied to him as well. If Kyle truly wanted to leave, he would have to get past him. Feeling the pressure of Leonhardt's killing intent, Kyle took a step back, surprised that Leonhardt was using such force to prevent him from simply stepping outside. He realized that, had he been an ordinary 13-year-old, he might have been paralyzed with fear or even collapsed. But Kyle smiled, knowing that he was far from ordinary. He then told Leonhardt to keep his word. Surprising the knight, Kyle walked up to him and lightly punched him on the shoulder before confidently walking past. Leonhardt watched as Kyle moved past him with his own aura still active. His expression calm but resolute. Turning back, Kyle asked how it felt and then pointed out to Leonhardt that he had gotten past him. Later, Kyle was outside, enjoying the refreshing air. And stretching his body happily. He reflected on how long it had been since he had last stepped. As he looked around, even though it was just a garden near the annex, he felt a sense of freedom and marveled at the beauty of the night sky, wondering if it had always been that breathtaking. His excitement grew when he noticed monoparticles scattered everywhere. Overcome with enthusiasm, he rushed toward them, thinking that he would devour them all. Leonhardt stood by, watching him. He hadn't expected Kyle to be so thrilled just to be outside. And it made him realize that, after all, Kyle was still just a kid. However, Leonhardt was still in shock, recalling how Kyle had managed to walk past him earlier. It confused him, knowing that Kyle hadn't trained in mana or aura and shouldn't have been able to withstand the pressure of his killing intent. While Kyle was busy gathering mana particles, he stole a glance at the stunned Leonhardt. He figured that Leonhardt was still rattled from what had happened earlier, and he knew the knight had every reason to be. Physically, Kyle was just a 13-year-old noble boy who had never been in a real fight. But mentally, he was a veteran who had survived countless virtual wars over 10 years in the virtual reality game Fantasy Defense. The game was famous for its realistic depictions of battle, and Kyle had grown desensitized to life or death moments. Horrific sights, piles of corpses, and the feeling of being drenched in blood. So, enduring a little scare tactic like Leonhardt's killing intent was almost second nature to him. After gathering enough mana particles, Kyle thought he would be able to clear more mana channels soon. As he finished, Leonhardt approached him, stating that he would be requesting punishment from Remto. Leonhardt explained that, although he had followed Remton's orders, it was wrong for him to direct killing intent toward the one he served. Therefore, he would seek punishment. Kyle assured him that it wasn't necessary, but if Leonhardt insisted on reporting to his father, he should also mention that Kyle didn't wish for Leonhardt to be punished. True to his word, Leonhardt reported everything to Remton, who was surprised by Kyle's request. Remton asked if it was true that Kyle had actually asked for his subordinate not to be punished. Leonhardt confirmed it, stating that Kyle's words were truthful. Remton clarified that it wasn't a matter of mistrusting Leonhardt, but simply hard to believe. Leonhardt acknowledged this, admitting that even he had trouble believing it. He reported that when Kyle had calmly faced his killing intent, he had doubted what he was seeing as well. Remton pondered, trying to understand how Kyle had resisted the killing intent of a knight as skilled as Leonhardt. He then asked what Kyle did afterward in the garden. Leonhardt, after a moment of thought, recalled the cold wind and the sound of moving water as Kyle sat in the garden. Focused. He responded to Remton that Kyle had meditated. Leonhardt slowly approached Kyle and asked if he knew how to meditate. Kyle responded that when he was younger his father had taught him some swordsmanship and it was during that time he also learned how to meditate. He then mentioned that he had quit shortly after, realizing he had no talent for it. Kyle instructed Leonhardt to ensure no one disturbed him while he meditated as it would disrupt his focus. Leonhardt acknowledged the request and later reported to Remton that Kyle remained in meditation, motionless for 6 hours straight. Remton, astonished, asked if Leonhardt had truly said 6 hours and not 6 seconds. Leonhardt confirmed, leaving Remton in disbelief. He recalled how, when Kyle was younger, he had tried to teach him swordsmanship. As a descendant of the Salterian family, it was expected that Kyle would follow the path of swordsmanship, and Remton had hoped Kyle would grow strong enough to overcome Hermimu. However, Kyle couldn't handle the training, complaining that his legs felt tangled, which had infuriated Remton. He had scolded Kyle, telling him to get up and reminding him that no weak descendant had ever come from their family. Certain that Kyle Had neither talent nor determination, Remton had given up on the idea of Kyle following the path of the sword. Yet now that same Kyle had meditated for 6 hours. Perplexed, Remton asked Leonhardt if Kyle had hit his head or if it was even possible for someone to change that quickly. Leonhardt reassured him, saying that he had checked everything, including the food, and found nothing amiss. He admitted that Kyle had seemed different recently, not just in his determination, but even in the way he looked at him. It was clear that something had changed. Remton, musing over this, decided that if Kyle was finally starting to mature, it wasn't a bad thing. He told Leonhardt to continue watching over Kyle, and Leonhardt agreed. Meanwhile, back in his room, Kyle focused on gathering mana from the air around him. As the mana collected in his hand, he began channeling it into his body, enhancing his perception skills. His sharpened senses allowed him to assess the condition of his body accurately. Feeling the mana coursing through him, he decided to attempt breaking through the mana channels all the way to his heart. The mana flowed through his arm, pierced through his shoulder, crawled along his spine, and finally reached his heart. Kyle clenched his teeth in pain but felt a wave of relief when the system indicated that the path to his heart had been cleared. The blocked channels trait was weakening. For the first time, Kyle could feel mana flowing through his entire body. Overjoyed, he realized that he had successfully gathered external mana and cleared the channels leading to his heart. This meant he could now use magic. Determined, he clenched his fist and decided to begin serious magic training. In that world, using magic required forming a mana circle near the heart. The higher the level of magic one wished to use, the more circles they needed to form. Creating multiple circles took time, which is why those aspiring to be mages began their training early, typically between the ages of 5 and 8. By age 12, they should have formed their first circle to be considered suited for the path of a mage. By those standards, Kyle, at 13, was a bit late to start learning magic. However, that was when he had been an ordinary NPC. Now, staring at his status window, Kyle knew that his situation was different. With the mana pathways talent and his mana channels cleared to the heart, he was finally in a state to learn magic. All he needed to do now was form his first mana circle. He pondered how to create it, wondering if he should attempt it the way he had learned in the game. Someone knocked on his door. It was Leonhardt. Leonhardt informed him that his father had lifted the restriction. He was surprised but pleased to hear this. Leonhardt added that the condition was that he must accompany him, and while he was allowed to leave his room and walk around the garden, he couldn't go outside the mansion. Excitedly he agreed, feeling that access to the garden was a good enough start. He thought Leonhardt must have spoken well to his father, confirming that winning Leonhardt over first had been a good idea. However, he noticed that Leonhardt's affection had decreased by 20 points. Puzzled, he wondered what he had done to receive a negative affection score, and recalled that Leonhardt's likability had been at negative 50 when he first rejected hostility. He speculated whether Leonhardt had been moved by watching him meditate all night. Remembering how exhausted he was after meditating for 6 hours, he considered whether Leonhardt was the type to be inspired by sweat and effort, much like in sports. With an idea in mind, he told Leonhardt that it was perfect timing because there was somewhere he needed to go with him. When Leonhardt asked where they were going, he simply replied that he would find out if he followed. They arrived at the library and the librarian was horrified to see him. He greeted her, but she immediately questioned how he had gotten there and rushed to Leonhardt for an explanation, reminding him that Kyle was forbidden from entering the library. Leonhardt informed her that Remton had lifted the restriction, which shocked the librarian even more. Tearfully, she recalled how Kyle had previously thrown books on the floor and torn them to pieces. She had begged him not to destroy the rare books she had obtained after traveling all over the Empire, but he had dismissed her pleas, stating that they were just paper she wouldn't be able to read once she was dead. He had then proceeded to tear them up and throw them away, leaving her in tears. She reminded Leonhardt that after that incident Kyle had been banned from the library. Again. He wondered if such a thing had actually happened. Clearing his throat to get their attention, he told the librarian that he had come to read books and asked if there were any related to magic. They both looked at him in confusion. She replied that while they didn't have many, they did have introductory-level books for beginners because the Duke's family had always emphasized swordsmanship over magic. He said that would be sufficient and requested the book that explains how to form circles. A moment later, he began reading about mana being the force that created everything, a form of supernatural energy. The text also mentioned that supernatural energy was a term defined by the scholar Joshua Alengren, associated with his birth story. Frustrated, he questioned whether this was truly an introductory book and why it was so complicated. Exhausted, he lay down, doubting that 7-year-olds could understand such material, and thinking it resembled a university thesis. He wondered if he really had to read all of it when, in a game, a status window would appear and the knowledge would be automatically learned. Suddenly, the status window showed that his insight skill was activated. Surprised, he watched as it began translating the low-level book's text. After the entire book was translated, a loading process appeared before him. When it reached 100%, the translation of Introductory Book 1 was complete. Amazed, he realized that the insight skill could also function as a translator. After glancing at the books next to him, Kyle decided there was no need to linger in the library any longer. He called out to the librarian, Alice, and instructed her to bring him more introductory books on circle formation, informing her that he would be borrowing all of them. Back in his room, Leonard placed the books on the table and reported that this was the last batch, all the books Kyle had requested. Kyle, pleased, complimented Leonard on carrying them so efficiently. Excited, Kyle eagerly scanned the books, prompting Leonard to ask if he was sure about borrowing so many at once. Confused, Kyle asked Leonard what he meant. Leonard explained that the librarian, Alice, had been very concerned. She had begged him to ensure the safe return of the borrowed books, as they were rare volumes, irreplaceable even if she sold her entire estate. Kyle reassured him not to worry, confident that he would finish reading them in no time. He jokingly asked if they were worried he might burn them. Leonard, remembering how Kyle used to despise reading, wondered aloud about the sudden interest. His curiosity grew as he noticed that the books were about mana usage and the basics of circle formation. Surprised, Leonard reminded Kyle that Hermanu's disease blocked the body's channels, preventing mana and aura from flowing through it. Before Leonard could finish, Kyle cut him off, stating that learning magic would indeed be difficult for him and asking if that was what Leonard had intended to say. Leonard apologized for overstepping, but Kyle assured him that he was correct. He acknowledged that everyone in the household likely thought the same, and that what he was doing must seem strange to them. This caught Leonard off guard. Kyle then clarified that, as the infamous disowned youngest son, no one would be surprised if he acted oddly 1 or 2 more times. He added that reading wouldn't harm anyone, and he understood why Leonard was concerned, worried that another failure might send Kyle into deeper despair. However, Kyle reminded him that, as he had said before, he didn't intend to die young. With a light punch on Leonard's shoulder, Kyle swore that he would do everything in his power to succeed. He then headed to his bed, announcing that it was time to lie down and read some more, leaving Leonard in stunned surprise. Leonard watched as Kyle lay down, picked up a book, and smiled happily. This triggered a memory of the Kyle Salterian he had known, a boy crying in the training hall, calling out for his father. Leonard had approached him then, concerned, and asked why he was crying. Kyle had tearfully replied that his father had told him he didn't need someone like him. Leonard had tried to console him, worried about his fragile state. As Leonard picked up one of the books, he reflected on how Kyle, once just a tearful child, was now slowly changing. He then glanced at his status window and was shocked to see Kyle's favorability score toward him had increased to 0, no longer than -30 it had been. Puzzled, Leonard wondered what had caused such a jump of 30 points so suddenly. Leonard placed the book on his bed and told Kyle that he would be waiting outside if he needed anything. Kyle, caught off guard, stuttered a reply of acknowledgement. Smiling, Leonard left the room, leaving Kyle to wonder if his reading had caused the change in favorability. He questioned why there had been no change in the library and if Leonard perhaps had a fondness for persistence. Kyle speculated that devouring so many books at once might have counted as persistence in Leonard's eyes. With a quiet laugh, he concluded that Leonard was indeed a strange guy. While Leonard, outside his room, walked away smiling. Once Leonard was gone, Kyle felt a wave of relief. Finally, he was alone. Surrounded by the books, he sat down and decided it was time to really dive into his studies. Activating his insight, he began decoding the text in the books. To his amazement, all the books started translating and processing at an incredible speed. He noticed that insight worked dozens of times faster than normal reading, with even the most difficult parts of the text being stored as easily understandable data. The system then notified him that the principles of circle formation had been digitized and saved. His understanding had increased and all the books in his vicinity had been. Excited by the speed and ease of the process, Kyle clicked on the principles of circle formation to move to the next step, forming a circle using the decoded data. The system confirmed that he had understood the principles of circle formation and met the minimum requirements to form his first circle. As he stared at the golden circle in front of him, Kyle knew that by directing mana along the golden path, he could form the circle, pushing the golden path toward his heart. He commanded it to move inside him. The force of the golden path entering his body caused the book's data around him to fly, and the system showed that the mana was following the path within him. He felt a sharp pain in his chest like his heart was burning, yet he knew he had to endure, or else the mana would backfire and damage his organs. The magic circle began to form in his heart as he pushed through the pain, constantly telling himself to hold on for just a little longer. When the golden path finally began to disappear, leaving behind a completed magic circle, the pain became nearly unbearable. He shouted internally, urging himself to endure just a little more. Moments later, the golden path vanished, leaving a perfect magic circle inside his heart. The pain faded, and Kyle opened his eyes, wondering if he had succeeded. The system confirmed it. He had successfully formed his first circle, his blocked channels had weakened, and his mana pathways had intensified. He could now store refined mana within the circle. Overjoyed, Kyle stood up, shouting in triumph that he had done it. However, his celebration was cut short. As a wave of dizziness hit him, he noticed the bright light outside his window, realizing that it was already morning. He had pulled an all-nighter before losing consciousness. Kyle thought to himself that Leonhart and Ursule were definitely going to scold him for this. And then he collapsed to the floor. A short while later, Ursule entered the room, bringing his breakfast. She gasped in shock when she saw him lying on the ground, surrounded by books, and rushed to him in worry, shouting to ask why he was on the floor and what was with all the books. In just one night, Kyle had successfully used all the mana he had accumulated to form his first circle. A new chapter in his life as Kyle Salterian, the official mage, had begun. Later that day, Alice was horrified when she saw the mess the books were in as Leonhart returned them. But Leonhart tried to comfort her, saying that at least none of the books were damaged. Days later, in the kitchen, Ursule carefully prepared Kyle's meal. As she placed the garnish on top of the meat, her preparations were complete. She smiled, remembering Kyle's reaction to the last meal she brought him and how he had praised it as incredibly delicious, just as he had expected from her. Grabbing the tray, she turned to deliver the food to Kyle. However, a group of maids blocked her path, asking if the food was meant for Kyle. She confirmed it was. Hai stepped forward, telling Ursule that they would deliver it for her so she could rest. Confused, Ursule asked what she was suddenly talking about. But Hai reminded her that serving Kyle was Sally's responsibility and that Ursule was only a temporary replacement. Sally chimed in, mentioning that Kyle's personality had improved recently and they were suggesting they return to the original arrangement. Ursule stared at them for a moment before replying that she didn't want to, and if they had complaints about their work or wanted changes they should take it up with Kyle directly. Furious, Hai shouted at Ursule, ordering her to stop. But Ursule continued walking. Before she could leave the kitchen, another maid entered, staring at her. The tension grew as Hai continued shouting, asking if Ursule really thought she was something special. Ursule said nothing and left the kitchen, ignoring the maid's glares. Arriving at Kyle's room, Ursule smiled as she watched Kyle enjoy the meal she had prepared. She asked if the food suited his taste and mentioned that she had adapted the recipe he had taught her last time. Kyle complimented her cooking, telling her that her skills improved. Shyly, Ursule admitted that she had been practicing hard every day and had even learned a few new recipes from the head chef. Kyle praised her diligence and hard work. After finishing his meal, Kyle put down his utensils and asked about her progress with spirit magic, making her visibly worried. He ordered her to bring the introductory book on spirit magic he had given her, which she quickly fetched. Opening the book, he asked how far she had read, and she replied that she was about halfway through. When Kyle examined the book, he was surprised to see the worn pages and detailed notes, realizing that Ursule had been studying diligently. He knew that, coming from a noble family, she had a solid basic education, so her learning speed wasn't slow. He also considered that, given her age, she was quite talented, and it would be ideal to build her skills gradually over time. However, he sighed, telling her that at her current pace, it wouldn't be enough, which left her surprised. Kyle knew they didn't have the luxury of time. In 2 months, the Salterian family would hold the heir succession ceremony, and on that day, the coup led by the second son, Adel, would take place. The Marquis family would fall, and Ursule, caught in the chaos, would lose her life. Kyle understood that she had to become stronger before then. He told Ursule that, for now, she should leave the cooking to someone else and focus solely on her studies. He explained that this would help her concentrate better, and he would have Sally take over serving him again. So she shouldn't worry. To his surprise, Ursule clenched her fists and shouted no in disagreement. Startled, Kyle called her name in confusion. Stuttering, she swore that she would work hard, continue studying spirit magic, and keep cooking without neglecting either. Tearfully, she begged him not to let someone else serve him, pleading to keep her duties. Her sincere gaze, filled with tears, left Kyle stunned. In that moment, he understood something deeper. Ursule had lost everything when her family collapsed. She had gone from being the daughter of a baronet to a slave, and now a maid. She had lost contact with her family and didn't even know if they were alive. It was only natural that she felt insecure, just as she had started adjusting to life as a maid and finding some stability. He had suddenly pushed her to prioritize studying spirit magic. Of course, she would be confused. Being a maid had given her a sense of purpose and security, which is why it had taken precedence over her magic studies. Kyle realized that Ursule must have feared that if she couldn't perform her duties as a maid properly, she might be kicked out of the mansion. He understood that it was his fault for not explaining the situation clearly. Gently, he asked her if she remembered what he had said when he brought her to the mansion, reminding her that she was his person now. He reassured her that he never abandoned his people and always protected them, which made her stop crying in surprise. Softly, Kyle told her that he didn't ask her to learn spirit magic without reason. She was an excellent maid, her cooking skills were outstanding, and she was diligent and meticulous. If she continued to work hard, she could be promoted to head maid. However, he reminded her that there were plenty of other maids in the mansion, meaning many could replace her in that role. Panicked, Ursula called out to him, but Kyle calmly asked her to consider what would happen if she became a spirit mage. He explained how rare and respected skilled spirit mages were. He told her that she would become a great person, the greatest spirit mage, and everyone would look up to her. She would stand tall above everyone else and no one in the world would be able to replace her. Kyle then asked how that sounded, remarking that it was amazing, but Ursula still hesitated. Worried, she asked if she could really do it. Kyle confidently reassured her, telling her that she absolutely could. Handing the book back to her, he told her once again that she could become the greatest spy. Ursula, happy and encouraged, accepted the book, replying that she would work hard because she trusted him. She hugged the book tightly and the system notified Kyle that her affection for him had increased by 60. Surprised by her answer, he gladly encouraged her, feeling content with her trust. Afterward, Kyle officially appointed Ursula as his personal maid, entrusting her with most of his personal affairs. To ensure she could study and work in peace, he moved her out of the shared maid quarters and gave her a private room. When he showed her the room, she was amazed. He knew it was not only better for her studies, but also for his security. Additionally, this way, she wouldn't have to worry about clashing with the other maids. Ursula expressed how much she loved the room, especially because it was so close to his, which left Kyle stunned for a moment. He asked if that was what she liked most about it, thinking she might be quite the attachment addict, to which she happily replied yes. Kyle then sincerely told her that they should work hard together and survive no matter what. Later, while Ursula was in the library, she noticed someone walking outside. She looked out of the window and saw Kyle walking with Leonhardt. Kyle waved at her, and though she was surprised for a moment, she smiled warmly at him. The system showed that her affection for him had increased by 65. Meanwhile, at the main mansion, a maid approached the second lord, Adel Salterian, asking for a moment of his time to deliver a report. After hearing what she had to say, Adel became interested. He asked if she was saying that Kyle had changed, to which the maid confirmed. She further reported that Kyle had recently been exercising and building his strength, as well as dedicating significant time to studying magic. Kyle's personality had also improved, and he no longer lashed out or hit the servants in anger. Adel, astonished that his foolish younger brother seemed to have matured, remarked that as the second brother, he supposed it was time to pay Kyle a visit. Back at the annex, after waving back to Ursula, Kyle continued walking with Leonhardt. He ordered Leonhardt to take him to a large, open space somewhere out of sight. Curious, Leonhardt asked what he was planning, to which Kyle replied that he wanted to conduct a magic experiment, surprising Leonhardt, who confusedly asked what he meant by magic experiment. A short while later, they arrived at the outermost part of the estate. Leonhardt informed him that the area was secluded, surrounded by dense trees, and not visible from the mansion. Kyle responded that it was perfect and instructed Leonhardt to ensure no one came near. Leonhardt acknowledged the order, leaning against a tree nearby, silently observing. He couldn't help but think that, due to Hermes' disease, Kyle shouldn't be able to master swordsmanship or magic. A few days of reading magic books shouldn't have changed that. But with the current Kyle, Leonhardt felt it just might be possible. Kyle gathered magic power in his hand and released it in the form of a magic missile. The missile shot toward a tree, piercing straight through it. Both Kyle and Leonhardt were shocked as the tree cracked in half and collapsed with a loud crash. Kyle, stunned by the noise, quickly asked Leonhardt if the sound could have been heard inside the mansion. Leonhardt reassured him, explaining that he had used his aura to suppress the explosion, so the sound of the tree falling wouldn't have been heard either. Kyle sighed in relief and complimented Leonhardt on his quick reflexes. However, Leonhardt, still in shock, asked when Kyle had formed a circle. Kyle replied that it hadn't been long and that he had simply followed the instructions from the book he borrowed from the library and it worked. Leonhardt, even more surprised, asked if that meant Kyle was now cured. Kyle confidently confirmed that he had overcome Hermanu's disease, releasing his magic in his palm as he spoke. Leonhardt stared at Kyle, recalling his earlier words about not planning to die young and doing everything he could to survive. It all made sense now, smiling. Leonhardt congratulated him on surpassing his disease. The system then notified Kyle that Leonhardt's favorability toward him had increased by 10, making him realize that Leonhardt was truly a man of perseverance. Leonhardt went on to explain that Magic Missile was typically a first circle spell, usually with the strength of a punch from an adult male. However, the power Kyle had displayed was far beyond that of a typical first circle spell, as evidenced by the destroyed tree. Kyle agreed, adding that the power he felt was more akin to a fourth circle spell. Even though he was still technically a first circle mage. He assured Leonhardt that despite his current rank, he had just unleashed a fourth circle level of power with a first circle spell. To which Leonhardt marveled at how incredible that was. Kyle admitted that even he hadn't expected such strength, leaving Leonhardt to wonder if he was some kind of prodigy. Kyle then remarked that, regardless of how they looked at it, such power was too conspicuous. Grateful for his inside talent, he reflected on how he had managed to read all the first circle magic books in the library thanks to it. Without insight, it would have taken him months just to form a circle. However, one question lingered in his mind: why was the magic usage decoded by insight different from the game? He remembered that according to the magic books, casting magic involved drawing a complex magic circle, followed by intricate calculations and equations before circulating mana to activate the spell, a very old-school method. In contrast, in the game, magic casting was much simpler. Players only needed to draw a basic magic symbol with mana, and the spell would activate immediately. It was easier, faster, and more. Kyle decided to try using magic. However, the power he unleashed was overwhelming. He knew this was a problem, as it wasn't time to reveal his full strength yet. Kyle asked Leonhardt if he could keep what he had just seen a secret. Leonhardt, taken aback, asked if he meant keeping it from his father as well. Kyle, with a soft smile, replied yes and playfully suggested they keep it between themselves. To his shock, the system immediately showed that Leonhardt's favorability had decreased. Kyle couldn't believe he was losing favor just for that, and he wondered if his cute tone was that off-putting. Shyly, Kyle explained that there was a reason for his secrecy. He didn't want anyone to know how strong he was just yet. Leonhardt, still puzzled, asked why. Kyle revealed that it was because of the upcoming succession ceremony in 2 months. This revelation startled Leonhardt, and Kyle asked if he was aware of the event. The succession ceremony in the Marquis of Salterian family was a traditional competition to determine the heir, not based on age, but on merit. The family judged candidates on personality, swordsmanship, wisdom, knowledge, public support, and the opinions of loyal followers. The goal was to select the most promising heir who could lead the family to greater prosperity. Currently, 2 individuals were fiercely competing for the position of heir, the eldest son, Abel Salterian, and the second son, Adolf Salterian. Abel, the eldest son of the Marquis' legitimate wife, was the most likely candidate. Known for his gentle nature and exceptional swordsmanship skills, Abel had been groomed to be the heir since childhood. He had grown up with high expectations as a model elite, primarily supported by the family's long-serving retainers. Adolf, also born of a legitimate wife, had long been overshadowed by his elder brother and overlooked for many years. However, as he matured, Adolf's personality became more composed, and his swordsmanship skills improved rapidly, allowing him to stand out. His supporters were mainly young, passionate knights, giving Adolf a reputation with the air of a gang leader. In a tense exchange, Adolf angrily stomped his foot, glaring at Abel. He asked if Abel was now ignoring him, his younger brother. Abel, appearing lost in thought, responded that he hadn't even noticed Adolf approaching. Adolf didn't buy the explanation, pointing out that Abel had manifested aura at the age of 5. How could he not sense someone nearby? Abel brushed it off, calling it a childhood fluke and saying it wasn't something worth bragging about, and that Adolf should stop bringing it up before people laughed at him. One of the elders with Abel joined in, noting that Adolf hadn't manifested aura until the age of 15, adding that his own son had been the same, making him worry his son lacked talent. Abel, with a calm smile, replied that some start slowly but grow quickly once they've taken that first difficult step, subtly encouraging Adolf. One of Adolf's knights, angered by the remark, shouted at the elders, asking if they wanted to die. Adolf quickly intervened, commanding his knights to stop and reminding them that they were in the main house, where their father resided, so they should not act recklessly. The knights stammered an apology, barely containing their frustration. Abel watched Adolf for a moment and complimented him, stating that he had trained his subordinates well and that he was indeed a worthy candidate for the heir of the Marquis of Saltarion. Adolf smiled back, warning Abel to laugh while he could because he wouldn't be laughing for much longer. With that, Adolf ordered his knights to leave, walking away while Abel watched him go, his expression thoughtful. Later, as Kyle cut his steak into pieces, he reflected on the upcoming succession ceremony, which was only 2 months away. The Saltarian Marquisate didn't follow the principle of primogeniture, and legitimacy or illegitimacy didn't matter. The sole criterion for selection was strength, meaning any direct descendant of his father was eligible to compete. However, there was an exception, him. Due to his illness, Kyle had been removed from the succession race early on. His third older brother, Duke, was also not involved in the struggle. Kyle knew that his being 15 wasn't a problem, but his swordsmanship and magic were far inferior to his much older brothers. Leonard then asked about the current state of the succession landscape. Kyle explained that it was a duel between his eldest brother, Abel, and his second eldest brother, Adolf. With the ceremony so close, neither Abel nor Adolf would welcome any unexpected developments. He then posed the question, what would happen if it became known that he, someone who had never been considered a threat, suddenly emerged with great power as a dark horse? He offered 2 possible reactions: either they would try to bring him to their side, or they would try to crush him while he was still young. Both Leonard and Ursel were surprised by Kyle's thinking. Leonard pointed out that it was an extreme way of looking at things, but admitted that throughout history, bloodshed over succession was not uncommon. Kyle confirmed that this was exactly what he meant. Kyle recalled the game's setting. Abel was essentially good-natured and would be fine with him. Adolf, on the other hand, would definitely try to kill him. From the beginning, Adolf had been plotting to wipe out the entire family. Kyle explained that, in his current position, having just overcome Hermimu and showing promise for the future, but still with limited skill as a young First Circle wizard, he could be seen as a potential ally. But if they didn't see value in him, the damage wouldn't be too severe. Leonard studied him for a moment before standing up, remarking that wizards often concealed their abilities to protect themselves. He had heard that many downplayed their circle level. In that context, Leonard acknowledged that Kyle's strategy made sense. However, he reminded Kyle that after the succession ceremony, he would have to report everything to his father, which made Kyle worry. The system showed Leonard's favorability toward Kyle decreasing again, and Kyle wondered if he had reached the limit of Leonard's patience. Kyle knew that Leonard's loyalty currently lay with his father, not him. It was unrealistic to expect Leonard to unconditionally support him at this point. Still, the fact that Leonard hadn't outright refused him was a better situation than before. Kyle smiled to himself, thinking that even if Leonard didn't fully agree yet, he would eventually make Leonard follow him. He stared at Leonard from behind with a confident, almost eerie determination, thinking he would win him over whether by stealing his loyalty or letting himself be stolen. Leonard, suddenly feeling chills, turned around to look at Kyle and asked if he was really serious about becoming a wizard. Momentarily confused, Kyle replied that he was. He asked Leonard if it wouldn't be a good thing for the renowned Salterian Marquis, known for its swordsmanship, to have a skilled wizard among them. Leonard smiled softly, a mix of pride and understanding in his expression, and told Kyle that it would indeed be good. This surprised Kyle. Leonard then cheerfully told Kyle that his father, the head of the family, would be happy to hear about his progress. The system displayed a notification showing that Leonard's favorability toward Kyle had increased by 30. Kyle could hardly believe the sudden boost in favorability and wondered if it was due to their recent conversation. Meanwhile, Leonard complimented Ursule on her cooking, particularly praising the steak. Ursule humbly replied that it was just a simple dish and thanked him. Excited by the favorability increase, Kyle speculated that eating together with Leonard might be the key to gaining his favor. Not wanting to miss the opportunity, he sweetly suggested that Leonard should eat with him in his room from now on. Leonard, confused, mentioned that he could eat at the knight's dormitory, but Kyle shouted that it was an order. Later that night, Kyle was surrounded by books, busily drawing symbols on paper. He reflected that using the magic activation method from the game would result in fast activation and immense power. But controlling that power was difficult. He didn't fully understand why the game's method made magic stronger yet harder to manage. After staring at the symbols for a while, frustrated by his inability to figure it out, he tossed the books and papers aside, deciding to set the issue aside for now. Once he calmed down, Kyle sat back in front of the. He knew that eventually, he would need to showcase his magic, but the standard magic activation method in this world was slow. While it was difficult to master, it allowed for precise control of power. Suddenly, an idea struck him: what if he combined the world's magic activation method with the game's, taking the best aspects of both? Just as he considered this, the system issued a warning, stating that a magic explosion could occur, and asking if he wanted to continue. Startled, Kyle jumped back, shouting in surprise. He then thought it over and realized that since the system asked for confirmation, it meant combining the two methods wasn't impossible. There was just a risk. He reasoned that high risk, high reward was a principle he was willing to follow. Without hesitation, he clicked yes on the warning. Suddenly, a strong surge of magic power flowed through his body. The system appeared again, reminding him that he was attempting to combine two activation methods and that a magic explosion could occur. Once more, it asked if he wanted to proceed. Kyle, now excited, clicked yes again. The system began analyzing his body and showed him that his understanding of magic missile was very high. It analyzed an efficient path and completed the combination, merging the two methods inside his magic circle. Kyle watched in awe as the two magic methods combined, successfully creating new magic. He released the combined magic missile spell and marveled at its power. Energized by the success, Kyle decided to experiment further. He adjusted the magic, adding and removing elements to refine it. The system issued more warnings, but Kyle ignored them, pushing forward with his modifications. Suddenly, an explosion erupted, causing significant damage. Ursule, who had been walking outside his room, heard the blast and rushed in, asking if he was okay. Kyle awkwardly laughed, explaining that he was fine and had just been practicing magic. He coughed, waving away the dust from the explosion. Concerned, Ursule asked how practicing Magic had led to the destruction of a wall in his room. Kyle sheepishly admitted that he should have conducted the experiment outside. Realizing this might have been the meaning of the systems. Warning, he made a mental note to set up a proper magic workshop with strong barriers for future experiments. Leonard then burst into the room, alarmed by the loud noise. He was shocked to see the destroyed wall and asked what had happened. Kyle casually told Leonard to help him clean up the mess, to which Leonard, though confused, agreed. Deciding to deal with the chaos first, Kyle focused on cleaning up before thinking about his experiments any further. The next day, Ursula was cooking, staring at the pot and feeling that something tasted a bit off. She recalled Kyle's recent comment that her dish had been a bit plain, and she began to worry about how to fix the flavor. Suddenly, a voice interrupted her thoughts. A maid, Daisy, smiled warmly and remarked that she could tell Ursula was preparing a meal for Kyle, complimenting her diligence. Ursula stared at Daisy for a moment, her expression cautious, and coldly replied that it was her job. Sensing her caution, Daisy quickly tried to ease the tension, suggesting that if the stew's seasoning fell off, Ursula could try adding a dash of nutmeg. Intrigued, Ursula listened as Daisy explained that nutmeg could enhance the flavor, bringing out a rich umami taste. Encouraged to trust her, Ursula added the nutmeg, stirred the pot, and tasted it. To her amazement, the flavor had improved dramatically. Lowering her guard slightly, Ursula asked if Daisy was good at cooking and if she could teach her more. Daisy, still smiling sweetly, responded that she'd be happy to help however she could. Daisy then offered to help carry the food to Kyle's room, and Ursula gratefully accepted. As they left the kitchen, Daisy pushing the food cart and Ursula holding the teapot, Daisy asked how Kyle had been lately. She remarked that she'd heard he had become much more polite and admitted she had been worried when Ursula became Kyle's exclusive maid, fearing he might trouble her or treat her harshly. Ursula reassured her that Kyle treated her well. Daisy laughed, commenting that it was good to hear, and that Kyle had indeed become more dignified, getting up early, exercising, and studying. Ursula shyly agreed, mentioning that Kyle had been working very hard lately. Later, when Ursula arrived at Kyle's room, she told him that Daisy had asked about him. Curious, Kyle asked if that was true, to which Ursula confirmed it, reporting that Daisy had inquired about what he had been up to and who he had been meeting. Kyle asked what she had told Daisy, and Ursula replied that she simply said she didn't know, as she didn't think she should reveal anything about him. She then asked if she had responded correctly. Kyle praised her for handling the situation well but advised her that in the future, it would be okay to answer moderately, as he wouldn't be able to hide the fact that he had overcome Hermimu and was learning magic forever. Ursula nodded, assuring him she'd keep that in mind. Kyle then thought to himself, surprised that things were already moving so quickly. He had expected someone to act first, but he couldn't believe how quickly the situation was escalating, especially with Adolphe, who seemed to be rushing things. Later that night, in the main mansion, Remton angrily asked Leonhardt if it was true that Kyle had overcome Hermimu. Leonhardt confirmed it, reporting that Kyle was now studying magic on his own. Although Leonhardt knew Kyle had already achieved the first circle and possessed power beyond that, he decided to withhold some details for now, honoring his promise to Kyle. Remton, still in disbelief, remembered how terrible Kyle's condition had been the last time he saw him. It was that memory that had driven Remton to be so angry and harsh with his son. Kyle, filled with rage, shouted at his father, asking if he had chosen to be born with such a body. He angrily added that Remton should have just killed him at birth, glaring at him with pure fury. This enraged Remton, who called Kyle a wretched fool. He then angrily declared that he would pretend Kyle didn't exist and ordered him to stay locked in his room, warning him not to cause any trouble. Kyle clenched his teeth in frustration and shouted in pain. Overwhelmed by his anger and helplessness, Remton vividly recalled that moment. Now, turning to Leonhardt, he asked how old Kyle was, to which Leonhardt replied that Kyle had recently turned 13. Remton then reflected that overcoming Hermamute typically required exceptional talent in magic or swordsmanship, and such talent usually manifested around the age of 5 or 6. For someone like Kyle, Remton asked if there had ever been cases of overcoming Hermamute at the late age of 13. Leonhardt admitted that he wasn't certain but confirmed that Kyle had indeed overcome Hermamute and that he had personally seen Kyle using first circle magic. Remton was left speechless by the revelation, wondering if it was truly a miracle. After a pause, he asked Leonhardt if he thought he should meet Kyle. Leonhardt, sensing his hesitation, responded by asking if Remton wanted to meet his son. Remton stuttered, unsure, explaining that Kyle probably still resented him. Leonhardt, surprised, noted that Kyle had actually said he wanted to speak with Remton personally. The following morning, Leonhardt approached Kyle, offering to convey anything Kyle wanted to say to his father. Kyle, however, disagreed, insisting that he needed to meet Remton in person to talk. As he jumped off the fence he had been sitting on, Leonhardt reminded him that he was still under house arrest and couldn't leave the annex without his father's permission. Kyle acknowledged this, explaining that was precisely why he had brought it up. He then ordered Leonhardt to inform his father that he really wanted to see him. Leonhardt, caught off guard by the intensity of the request, hesitated. Seeing no response, Kyle resorted to a softer tone, almost begging Leonhardt to deliver the message. Leonhardt, visibly uncomfortable with Kyle's tone, reluctantly agreed, noting to himself that Kyle didn't seem to harbor any resentment toward his father. When Leonhardt later delivered the message to Remton, the Marquis was excited, eagerly asking what Kyle had said about him. Leonhardt cleared his throat and replied that Kyle actually wanted to meet with him in person. Remton Salterian, the head of the esteemed Salterian Marquisate, a renowned swordsmanship family that had protected the frontier from monsters for generations, stood before the portrait of his own father. One of only 5 sword masters on the continent and Kyle Salterian's father, Remton commanded respect. As Kyle faced the portrait, he noticed his hands trembling. And the realization hit him, Kyle's body still remembered the fear and resentment toward his father. Before Li Haiyanwu possessed Kyle's body, there had been a painful history between Kyle and Remton. In one memory, Remton had pointed a training sword at Kyle, shouting at him, demanding why he wasn't already holding his sword. Remton angrily asked if he's really the son of the renowned Salterian family. Kyle, weakened by his illness, had cried, shaking as he tried to explain that it was too hard for him. Furious, Remton had shouted that he couldn't believe such weakness existed in a Salterian child. He told Kyle he was utterly useless to the family. Kyle had been crushed, asking himself if he was truly useless, if he really couldn't use sword aura, and if he was destined to die from his illness. Desperate, Kyle had begged his father not to abandon him. The painful memory resurfaced as Kyle stared at the portrait, but he exhaled deeply, calming himself. He knew the memory belonged to the original owner of the body, but now it was also his memory. Since his soul and Kyle's had merged, the emotional weight of Kyle's fear and pain was fully conveyed to him. However, the current Kyle was no longer the same coward he used to be, because now, he was also Li Haiyanwu. He was an adult with the strength of mind to confront this. He swore to himself that he would prove Kyle Salterian's worth. Moments later, Kyle faced Remton and smiled brightly. Remton, meeting his gaze, asked if he had something to say. Kyle, respectfully addressing him as Marquis, replied that he did. Remton was caught off guard by the formality Kyle had always called him father. And this sudden shift left him unsure of Kyle's intentions. Remton reminded him that he had been ordered not to leave his room without permission, though he had been granted use of the library due to his quiet studying. However, if Kyle caused any more trouble, Remton warned The punishment would go beyond house arrest. Remton asked if Kyle understood the severity. Kyle felt his body trembling again, the fear and distrust toward Remton still lingering. It was no surprise, given the trouble the previous Kyle had caused. Moreover, Remton's status as one of the 5 sword masters on the continent was undeniable. When Kyle activated his insight ability, it couldn't access any information about Remton, instead displaying a message indicating that Remton was a formidable opponent. Kyle had wanted to gauge Remton's favorability using insight, but it seemed that would be impossible for now. He realized there was no other option but to resolve this situation through negotiation. Kyle respectfully replied that he understood and explained that this was precisely why he had requested a meeting through Leonhardt. Remton, taken aback, recalled how Kyle used to lose his temper and argue back at the slightest provocation. Now, Kyle's calm demeanor and respectful tone surprised him. "It seems you've matured," Remton remarked. Kyle agreed and admitted that he had caused a lot of trouble and headaches for his father in the past. He then did something Remton never expected. He respectfully apologized for his past behavior, taking full responsibility and promising that he would change from now on. Remton was so stunned by what he was hearing that he stood up from his chair. He could hardly believe that Kyle, who had always blamed others and thrown tantrums, was now apologizing. Remton snapped to attention when Kyle mentioned that he had one more thing to say. He wanted to propose a deal. Remton, narrowing his eyes, asked what Kyle meant by a deal. Kyle responded that, as Remton must have heard from Leonhardt, he had overcome Hermanut. Remton acknowledged this but admitted it was hard to believe that such a miraculous thing could really happen. Kyle agreed and, without hesitation, released magic power from his hand, shocking his father. Addressing him formally as Marquis, Kyle told Remton that he was now a first circle mage. To further prove his point, he released more magic, spreading the aura around them. Remton, initially skeptical even after hearing Leonhardt's report, now had no choice but to. He could sense the flow of mana from Kyle and acknowledged what he was witnessing. Kyle continued, explaining that he would only continue to grow stronger. He noted that it was well known that mages who overcome Hermanut have exceptional potential, and it hadn't taken him long to reach the first circle on his own. He then asked Remton if it wouldn't be beneficial for their family to produce a skilled mage from its direct line, even though the Salterian Marquis VIII was renowned for swordsmanship. Kyle proposed that if the family supported him in becoming a great mage, he would use his abilities for the benefit of the Salterian family. He promised to become a powerful asset, helping the family rise above all others in the country by boasting both swordsmanship and magic. He then asked Remton what he thought of the idea, pointing out that the deal would benefit both the family and himself, making him a worthy investment. Kyle knew that life was all about give and take. The fastest way to gain someone's favor was to show them what he could offer. He was also well aware that Remton valued the family's gains in honor above all else. Simply appealing to family bonds would not be enough to persuade his father. Remton was known for making cold-hearted decisions in the name of the family, even if they seemed harsh. In the past, Kyle had felt bitter about his father's nature and had deliberately caused trouble, hoping to gain his attention. However, such tricks never worked. On Remton, they always backfired. But now, Kyle understood that if their interests aligned, they could still cooperate, even if their relationship remained strained. This was how adults handled things. Remton stood in silence, surprised, as he stared at Kyle. He wondered if this was truly the same Kyle he once knew. The boy who had once caused so much trouble had grown into someone who could make rational, calculated proposals, no longer the child he had been. Remton couldn't believe that Kyle had accurately identified what the other party needed and negotiated successfully, ultimately getting what he wanted. Remton knew that the ability to wield power and authority wisely was a virtue noble children must learn. This made it even harder for him to believe that the boy who used to throw tantrums could now speak with such confidence. Remtun, who had once considered Kyle a failure of the family and neglected him, realized how much Kyle had grown without him noticing. He replied by acknowledging Kyle as a valuable asset to the Sultarian family and assured him that he would spare no expense in providing funds and magic stones for his studies. He then encouraged Kyle to show his worth, to which Kyle confidently responded that he would live up to his expectations. A few days later, Kyle excitedly asked Leonhardt and Ursiel what they thought as he introduced them to his new magic workshop. He explained that he had reinforced the interior with a barrier magic artifact and equipped it with tools for potion making and artifact crafting, ensuring there were no more holes in the walls. Leonhardt, while looking around, replied that it was amazing and must have cost a lot. He then asked where Kyle got the money, as it didn't seem like his allowance could cover such expenses. Kyle proudly responded that it was all his father's money and boasted that his charming demeanor had made his father gladly provide the funds. Leonhardt, feeling disgusted, wondered aloud if Kyle's charm really worked on his father, while Kyle called Ursiel to come closer. When Ursiel approached, she asked if there was something he needed her to do, but Kyle replied that wasn't the case. He opened a door inside the workshop and explained that it was hard to use spirit magic freely in the main room, which was why he had created a separate space. He also mentioned that the room was equipped with soundproofing and anti-vibration facilities so she could practice her spirit arts without worry. Additionally, he had gathered related books and spirit stones for her to use as much as she liked. Ursiel, touched by his thoughtfulness, shyly and wordly asked if she could really use the room, reminding him that it was right next to his workshop. Kyle reassured her, telling her to feel free to use it as much as she wanted. He reminded her, as he had said before, that he wanted her to become his right hand, not just a maid who served him, but a spirit user who was. Ursiel was so moved that she was momentarily stunned before bursting into tears, which surprised Kyle. She then swore to work hard, learn everything she could, and become someone who could truly help him. The system showed that Ursiel's favorability toward Kyle increased by 70. He smiled at her and told her it was good, not noticing the glowing crystals on the table. Suddenly, a magic circle appeared on the floor near Ursiel's feet, emitting a bright, intense light that caught their attention and left them in shock. Kyle asked why the spirit circle was reacting all of a sudden and questioned Ursiel if she had used spirit arts, but she replied that she hadn't done anything. He was stunned. Knowing the glow signaled a summoning. Mana quickly gathered above them, changing color and forming into something. Within a minute, a spirit was summoned and emitted a happy sound, rushing toward Ursiel. Kyle was shocked, thinking that since the spirit immediately approached her, it must have been Ursiel who summoned it. Ursiel, confused, asked if it was indeed a spirit. But Kyle was lost in thought, marveling that Ursiel truly possessed the talent to be an eternal friend of spirits. He then praised her, telling her that she could already summon a spirit. To which Ursiel, still flustered, stammered that she hadn't done anything. He explained to her that the techniques of a spirit user are a bit different from magic spells or incantations. He mentioned that spirit users naturally feel the energy of spirits with their soul, and suggested that perhaps, when her emotions heightened, the spirit stone in the workshop responded, leading to the summoning of the spirit. She then looked at the spirit lovingly, embracing her, and he informed her that the spirit stone, which had been full just a moment ago, was now completely used up. Panicking, she asked him what she should do and whether she had used it all up. He reassured her, telling her that it was no big deal and that the stone was placed there for her to use. He gazed at her, surprised that she had summoned a spirit so quickly, and wondered what kind of spirit it was. His insight ability showed him that it was a high-level being, but it couldn't identify the spirit, making him realize that, despite its small size, it was of such a high level that even insight didn't work. He then asked Ursiel if she knew what kind of spirit it was. She replied that she would ask the spirit itself and began communicating with it. After a brief conversation, she told him the spirit's name was Asura, an ancient spirit of light. Shocked, he shouted in disbelief, asking if the chubby little creature was truly an ancient spirit of light. The spirit angrily responded to him. Ancient spirits are the highest tier of spirits and summoning one is a rare feat. Even after using up all of one's spirit stones and praying for 3 days and nights. Yet Ursule had summoned one on her first try and did so unconsciously. However, he thought that for an ancient spirit, it looked a bit too unimpressive, which angered the spirit, causing it to bite his head. Ursule explained that Asura said this wasn't its true form and that if it returned to its original form, the mansion would collapse. He quickly replied that he understood. She then gently grabbed Asura while Leonard asked if he was okay, seeing him in tears while holding his head. Ursule told him that Asura wanted to be her friend and asked what she should do. He explained that Asura was asking to form a contract and, since it had come to her unconsciously, she must have a very strong affinity with it. Ursule then asked Asura if it truly wanted to make a contract with her and if it was really okay, to which the spirit happily agreed. They opened a contract magic circle and Ursule swore, "I, Ursule Helheim, make the truest contract with the ancient spirit of light, Asura." Asura opened its eyes and declared that Ursule Helheim would be recorded as its summoner, then asked her to choose a name for it as an ID. Kyle, interrupting, suggested the name Flappy, causing Asura to stare at him in silence for a moment before asking again for a name. Yet again, Kyle insisted that its name should be Flappy and the spirit, feeling defeated, confirmed its name as Flappy. Kyle laughed. After the contract was complete, Flappy opened its eyes and happily rushed toward Ursule, who thanked it for becoming her friend and said that from today, it would be known as Flappy. The spirit joyfully agreed. Ursule and Flappy sealed their contract, while Kyle watched proudly, glad that his talent development project was progressing so well. Some time passed. And a few days later, Kyle received a visitor, one of his brothers. His brother mentioned that he hadn't been paying enough attention to Kyle as his older brother, but Kyle responded that it was nothing at all, and if anything, he should have visited his brother first. He then called out to Adolf, his second brother. Ursule then poured them tea while Adolf stared at her. She asked if there was anything else they needed, and Kyle replied that she had worked hard and should rest, which she immediately agreed to before walking away. Adolf silently continued to watch her. He then asked Kyle if he was right in thinking that Ursule was the one he had bought from the slave market. Adolf remarked that she was quite pretty and mentioned that he happened to need a new maid. He then asked if Kyle could send Ursule to him, causing Kyle to stop drinking his tea in surprise. Kyle immediately thought Adolf was a scummy brat. He knew Adolf had come because he had heard the news about his healed Hermamo and was frustrated that this was the first thing Adolf mentioned. Feigning shyness, Kyle replied, no, and suggested that perhaps Adolf could choose someone other than Ursule. To avoid suspicion, Kyle decided to act as though he had a crush on her, blushing and acting shy. Adolf, surprised by Kyle's reaction, burst into laughter and told him he was just joking, that he wasn't such a scoundrel that he would take away a girl Kyle liked. Kyle, still playing along, shyly told Adolf not to tease him like that because it had startled him, to which Adolf laughingly agreed. Adolf thought that for now he would have to give up on the idea as he couldn't afford to antagonize Kyle yet. He recalled hearing rumors that the prodigal son had reformed. But seeing Kyle interested in women at such a young age made Adolf think Kyle was still a lost cause, which was better for his own plans. It would make it easier to corrupt Kyle and lead him into darkness. Adolf then told Kyle that if he had known his younger brother was so amusing he would have befriended him much earlier. Adolf also noted that Kyle's body seemed to have recovered quite well, to which Kyle agreed, saying that his daily life was no longer hindered by major problems, though his Hermamo wasn't. completely healed yet but was gradually improving. Curious Adolf asked what Kyle meant by not fully healed, to which Kyle explained that it was a long-term illness, so it was difficult to heal it all at once, but it was steadily getting better. Kyle then told Adolf to watch him, surprising Adolf as Kyle began releasing magic. Kyle proudly revealed that it was a magic spell he had created and that it was about 1.5 times stronger than ordinary spells. He asked Adolf what he thought of it, and Adolf, smiling thoughtfully, replied that it was impressive that Kyle could create magic as well. Kyle happily thanked him. Adolf, however, quietly assessed the situation. Although Kyle's illness wasn't cured, his rapid growth and the fact that he was only at the student level of the first circle wouldn't threaten the succession. Adolf also remembered Daisy reporting that Kyle's attitude had changed dramatically, almost as if he were a different person, and that his magical abilities were improving. Adolf figured Daisy's report must have been exaggerated, but he thought it wise to stay cautious nonetheless. Still, he smiled creepily, confident that Kyle was just a 13-year-old boy and not worth worrying about too much. Adolf reasoned that it would be more beneficial to manipulate Kyle for his own purposes, and when Kyle became useless he would simply discard him. Adolf then directly asked Kyle if he had thought about joining his side. Kyle feigned surprise, asking Adolf if that's what he truly meant, to which Adolf seriously nodded. Kyle remained silent for a moment before smiling, knowing he had just gained an advantage over Adolf. After a bit more conversation, Adolf said goodbye, telling Kyle that he would get permission from their father. Kyle politely agreed, thanking Adolf for entrusting the matter to him. Adolf stepped out of Kyle's room and saw Leonhardt waiting. Leonhardt respectfully bowed to Adolf and wished him a safe journey. Adolf was irritated at the sight of Leonhardt, knowing that he was a tough nut to crack. Despite all efforts to coax Leonhardt, he had yet to switch sides. Still, Adolf thought it was better for Leonhardt to remain neutral than to join Abel's side. He concluded that it was preferable for Leonhardt to rot under the command of a snot-nosed kid. Adolf sneered and told Leonhardt that he looked terrible, adding that he couldn't believe the darling of the knights was now guarding a mere child. With that, Adolf walked away, his guard following, leaving Leonhardt staring silently after him. Leonhardt then turned to Kyle's door and peeked inside. Kyle invited him in, informing him that the discussion with his brother Adolf had concluded and that Adolf had asked him to join the subjugation team. He explained that he would likely be acting alongside Viscount Giro, one of Adolf's close aides from the 5th Legion, and that the mission would be his first test of loyalty to Adolf. At the same time, it was an opportunity to gain recognition from the family. Leonhardt, surprised, immediately offered to join the subjugation team as well. However, Kyle ordered him not to follow, explaining that Adolf would become suspicious if Leonhardt, a trusted knight of their father, were around. Kyle needed to earn Adolf's trust, and bringing along his father's men would jeopardize that. Leonhardt disagreed, reminding Kyle that the mission could be dangerous and might even be a trap. Kyle acknowledged the danger but explained that Adolf was likely testing his combat usefulness and would probably expose him to peril on purpose. Releasing a surge of magic power, Kyle reassured Leonhardt that he could protect himself now and urged him not to worry. He added that he wouldn't be showing his full abilities during the mission. Changing the subject, Kyle asked Leonhardt if he had ever heard of the Orage function. Days later, in the southern part of Traston territory, there was a forest with a monster colony that the Sultarian Marquis regularly cleared using subjugation teams. Kyle arrived at the location, staff in hand, when a man dismounted his horse and introduced himself as Viscount Jerome. Jerome mentioned that he had heard about Kyle from Adolf and that they would be working together on this subjugation team. Kyle, smiling, responded that this would be his first real combat experience and asked Jerome to take care of him. Jerome reassured Kyle that he would protect him, but Kyle couldn't help but wonder what Jerome meant by that, as the system showed Jerome's favorability toward him had dropped by -40 points. Puzzled, Kyle decided to avoid Jerome for the time being. He excused himself to prepare on the side, and Jerome agreed, telling him to reach out if he needed anything. As Kyle walked away, Jerome stared at him, thinking that since Kyle was just a first circle mage, he probably didn't know much and needed to be watched to ensure he didn't die. Frustrated, Jerome reflected on how even during this subjugation Adolf had given him such a difficult task. He wondered what a bedridden kid with a deadly illness could do, and was annoyed that he now had the responsibility of ensuring Kyle's safety. He thought it would be a relief if Kyle simply didn't hinder the battle. A short while later, as the subjugation began, Kyle released a lightning spell that electrocuted a group of goblins. The knights were astonished, as a single bolt wiped out the entire group. Jerome excitedly praised Kyle, who continued to wipe out more monsters using his powerful lightning and fire magic. With each display of power, the knights and Jerome's favorability toward Kyle increased. Jerome then congratulated Kyle for being amazing, declaring that this was the easiest subjugation battle ever. The system showed that Jerome's favorability had increased by 50 points, leaving Kyle surprised, as he had never encountered such an easy target. He was amazed that Jerome's favorability had jumped by a total of 90 points in one go. Jerome, now enthusiastic, told Kyle that Adolf would be pleased to hear about his performance, and the other knights agreed. As they continued to praise him, Kyle touched his pocket deep in thought, wondering if now was the right time to proceed with his next plan. Night had fallen, and the group gathered around the bonfire, resting after the battle. The knights cheered and congratulated Kyle on his victory, but he shyly told them that he had done nothing to deserve such praise. Jerome, however, assured him that his magical skills were truly impressive, and the other knights agreed. They admitted they had held misconceptions about him because he was young and had always stayed in the manor. They thought he would struggle with both combat and camping. Yet not only had he bravely joined the battle, but he hadn't complained about the harsh camping conditions or the food. They praised him for being surprisingly mature for his age. Kyle smiled and responded humbly, saying that his brother Adolf must have lived like this every time he went on a monstrous abjugation. Thinking about that, Kyle couldn't allow himself to be a spoiled brat. His words left the knights amazed and touched. Jerome then remarked that he didn't know Kyle admired Adolf so deeply, but reassured him that he would make sure to tell Adolf how much Kyle admired him and how greatly he had excelled in. The system notified Kyle that Jerome's favorability had increased by 60 points, with the other knights also agreeing and increasing their favorability as well. Kyle couldn't help but think that they were easy to win over. A short while later, the bonfire was extinguished and the knights had fallen into a deep sleep inside their tents. Kyle emerged from his tent and informed the guarding knight that he was just going to take a walk. He then ordered the knight to get some rest, to which the knight sleepily agreed, telling Kyle not to wander too far. As Kyle walked away, he noticed the guard yawning, realizing that no one suspected anything, because they still saw him as just a child. He knew the knights, encouraged by their victory, had collapsed from exhaustion and only a few sentries remained on duty. However, they weren't overly concerned, focusing more on goblins and less on larger threats. Kyle smirked, wondering aloud what they would do if they encountered ogres. He laughed to himself, recalling how in the game he used ogres for experienced farming. Kyle pulled out a small bottle of ogre perfume, a concoction he had created that could summon ogres within a 10-kilometer radius. Before crafting it, he had discussed it with Leonhardt. Leonhardt, unfamiliar with the item, had asked what it was. Kyle had explained that as far as he knew, no one in this world had discovered the recipe yet, so it was likely that he was the first to create it. He told Leonhardt that the perfume literally summoned ogres, and the higher the quality, the larger the radius of its effect. Leonhardt had expressed concern, reminding Kyle that their subjugation target was the goblin colony, and ogres were high-level monsters far more dangerous than goblins. The team might struggle to handle them. Kyle had calmly replied that this was exactly what he was aiming for. Kyle explained to Leonhardt that 12 expert knights were participating in this subjugation mission. While goblins were manageable, ogres were a completely different story. He pointed out that although the 5th Legion was called a knight order, they were nothing more than a ragtag group of mediocre soldiers loyal to Adolf. Kyle knew that the Legion was made up of street criminals whom Adolf had brainwashed using dark powers. The intense brainwashing had turned them into fanatics, allowing Adolf to expand his influence easily and demonstrate his ability to lead even the most hopeless individuals. These soldiers, now mindlessly obedient, would be used strategically by Adolf when the time for the succession ceremony came. Kyle reflected on how dangerous the brainwashed high-level knights were and that they would be a serious problem if Adolf made a move during the ceremony. His plan was to weaken the 5th Legion as much as possible before the succession, starting with the 12 expert knights who had joined this mission. He knew they would fight bravely to the death against the ogres, and in the end only he would survive the deadly battle. Back in the present, Kyle opened the bottle of ogre perfume and its scent wafted through the air, awakening a nearby ogre that immediately began searching for the source of the smell. Kyle smirked, thinking to himself that he would return to the manor with the accomplishment of defeating the ogre. The enraged ogre reached the camp and let out a deafening roar, launching a brutal attack that startled the sleeping knights. They awoke in terror and fled, but the high knights rushed to face the threat, shouting to their comrades not to retreat as it was just an ogre. However, to their horror, the ogre easily grabbed one of the knights and crushed him to death. The sight of an expert knight being killed so effortlessly shocked everyone, leaving them paralyzed with fear. The other knights began to doubt how they as intermediates could possibly stand a chance. The knights retreated in fear, but Kyle appeared and shouted for them to come to their senses. He demanded to know if this was how the honorable Soltarian knights behaved in the face of danger. The knights were stunned to see him, and Kyle continued yelling that if they retreated, the ogre would break through into the territory. Meanwhile, the ogre continued its rampage, killing any knight who dared approach. Kyle shouted again, telling the knights that they must stop the ogre here no matter what. The knights, emboldened by his words, vowed to follow him. Just then Viscount Jerome appeared on horseback, shouting that he was glad Kyle was safe. Jerome told Kyle to leave the battle to him as a high-level knight because Adolf had ordered him to ensure nothing happened to Kyle. Jerome urged Kyle to seek shelter while he held off the ogre. However, Kyle disagreed, responding that he wouldn't run away. He told Jerome seriously that he would fight alongside the knights until the end, as he couldn't face Adolf if he abandoned his men and fled. Kyle then looked at Jerome and asked if he wasn't right, which left Jerome touched and amazed by Kyle's resolve. Kyle then released his magic power and cast a haste spell on Jerome, surprising him. Jerome immediately felt lighter and more agile. Kyle explained that since he was still a first circle mage, he would focus on providing support and controlling the battle from the back. He then ordered Jerome to lead the charge at the front, to which Jerome agreed, telling Kyle to leave it to him. Jerome drew his sword, astonished by Kyle's bravery in staying to fight rather than retreating. Jerome thought to himself that Kyle was an indispensable asset to Adolf and resolved to report to Adolf that Kyle could be trusted without hesitation. Jerome unleashed his powerful knight aura, the force of which cracked the ground beneath his feet. He roared at the ogre, challenging it to bring the fight to him, and charged forward, identifying the beast as a twin-headed ogre. The other knights, shocked at Jerome's bravery, watched in awe, seeing both Jerome and Kyle refusing to retreat. The knights realized they couldn't show cowardice, and they decided to follow Jerome's lead, rushing forward to join the attack on the twin-headed ogre. Kyle shouted at them to give it their all as they charged alongside Jerome. Kyle smiled as he watched the scene unfold, satisfied with how the knights responded to his rallying cry. He thought to himself that the ogre perfume had performed exceptionally well, summoning a variant that was 2 to 3 times more dangerous than a typical ogre. He quietly walked away from the front lines, whispering for the knights to keep fighting, knowing that this was where many of them would meet their end. The ogre continued its rampage, killing more and more high-ranking knights. Jerome, furious, charged at the ogre, shouting that he was its match. The ogre turned upon hearing Jerome's voice, and Jerome slashed it from behind. While Jerome was occupied with the battle, one of the remaining high-ranking knights froze in fear, staring at the bodies of his fallen comrades. He realized that only a few of them were left and shouted in panic, asking if they were really going to make it out alive. He cried out that the ogre was far too strong for them. Kyle noticed the man and smiled to himself, thinking, "It better be, otherwise there's no point." He silently vowed to wipe out every last one of those high-ranking knights tainted by darkness, knowing that this imposing ogre would serve that very mission. Jerome paused for a moment to catch his breath. Out of the 12 high-ranking knights who had started the battle, only 3, including himself, remained. He wondered if they could actually win and whether it was time to use his last resort. Jerome recalled Adolf telling him that he had gained the power of darkness and that he should feel its strength coursing through him. However, Adolf had warned him that unleashing the full extent of that power would prevent him from returning to his original form, turning him into a rampaging monster devoid of humanity. Adolf had made it clear that Jerome must never carelessly release that power. Jerome thought that if he unleashed it he could defeat the twin-headed ogre, but at the cost of losing himself. Still, he wondered if that wasn't better than dying. Suddenly a bolt of strong thunder magic struck the ogre, electrocuting it and snapping Jerome back to reality. Jerome remembered Kyle, who then shouted to him that he would provide magical protection, urging Jerome to push forward. Jerome stammered out a reply, relieved that Kyle, their wizard, was on their side. He thought it was still too early to use his last resort. As Kyle cast a spell, he activated his mental cleansing skill, boosting the morale of the knights. Jerome felt a surge of energy and clarity, as did the other knights. Feeling reinvigorated, Jerome confidently shouted that they were the 5th Legion under Adolf's command and that they should show their true strength. With renewed resolve, Jerome and the knights launched another attack on the ogre. One of the knights managed to strike the ogre's head with his sword, and the others continued slashing at it. Meanwhile, Kyle observed the battle from a distance, counting the remaining high-ranking knights. Joshua, one of the high-ranking knights, was killed when the ogre hurled him into the air. Another knight was captured and squeezed to death before being slammed into a wall. Kyle smiled as he realized that only Jerome, the last of the high-ranking knights, remained. His priority had been to eliminate the 12 knights empowered by Adolf, and with most of them gone, only Viscount Jerome was left. Jerome, determined to avenge his comrades, shouted that their sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. He called out to Kyle, asking for one last spell to help him finish off the mutant ogre. Kyle, knowing the moment had come, smiled and cast another spell. Using his ensnare skill, he summoned a swarm of invisible hands that tightly restrained Jerome, trapping him in place. Jerome, shocked, struggled to move and demanded to know what was happening. Kyle calmly told him to keep his eyes forward, as the ogre was already upon him. Jerome panicked as he saw the ogre approaching, but before he could react, the ogre raised its massive hand and decapitated him in one swift motion. Blood splattered everywhere as Jerome's body collapsed, leaving the remaining knights in horror. They stared in disbelief, paralyzed by the realization that even Jerome had fallen. Panic set in and the knights began shouting that they were going to die, drawing the ogre's attention. Fearfully, they wondered aloud if they would all meet the same fate as Jerome. Suddenly a powerful fire spell descended upon the ogre, engulfing it in flames. The creature screamed in agony as it burned, and the knights stood in shock, watching the ogre slowly fall to the ground, finally dead. Kyle jumped down to the scene, announcing that it was over. The knights, still stunned, called out to him as he approached the ogre's corpse, smiling. He grabbed the high-grade inner core from the ogre, knowing it was time to wrap up the charade. He turned to the remaining knights and shouted that the mutant ogre was dead thanks to the opportunity Jerome had provided. Clenching his fist for emphasis, he declared that the victory belonged to the 12 brave high-level knights and to everyone who had fought valiantly, risking their lives for the cause. As the first light of the rising sun illuminated the scene, Kyle softly told them, "We did it." The knights, still in shock, took a moment to process his words. Slowly realization dawned and they erupted in cheers, celebrating their survival and praising Kyle. He smiled to himself, knowing his plan had succeeded perfectly. Bro is master manipulator. The subjugation was deemed a success. They had eliminated the mutant twin-headed ogre and wiped out the goblin den which had been their original objective. However, the victory came at a significant cost with many high-level knights lost. As they neared the mansion, someone shouted his name. It was Adolf rushing towards him. Adolf demanded to know if it was true that Jerome was dead. Kyle bowed his head and replied, yes, explaining that Jerome had fallen in a fierce battle with the mutant ogre. Adolf rushed to the covered body and pulled back the white cloth to see for himself. Upon seeing Jerome's headless corpse, Adolf was visibly shocked. Adolf wondered if Jerome hadn't had the chance to use his dark powers in the battle. He knew that losing Jerome along with the other high-level knights was a severe blow. The loss of these key figures created a power vacuum. But Adolf also knew that there was nothing to be done and thought that somehow they would need to manipulate this ogre-related incident to their advantage. Feigning sadness, Adolf told Kyle he was relieved he had returned safely. Then Adolf stepped closer and acknowledged that defeating the mutant ogre was Kyle's achievement. He patted Kyle on the head and promised to inform their father, ensuring Kyle would be properly honored. Kyle smiled and thanked Adolf, but Adolf didn't smile back. He simply stared at Kyle before furiously turning on his heel and storming back toward the mansion. Kyle, still smiling, thought to himself that for now it seemed Adolf had been deceived quite well. Later at the annex, Kyle proudly remarked to Leonhardt and Ursel that he had killed 2 birds with 1 stone, defeating the 5th Legion, gaining recognition from Adolf and even acquiring the mutant ogre's core. Ursel carefully wiped his head as he added, laughing, that perhaps it was more like killing 3 birds with 1 stone. Leonhardt, concerned, told Kyle that what he did was dangerous but that it was a relief he returned safely. Kyle shrugged it off, saying it wasn't a big deal and that he could have defeated the mutant ogre on his own. He explained that he had only pretended to be weak to show that while he had abilities he was still harmless. Leonhardt then asked if Kyle planned to join Adolf's side now and what his intentions were regarding Abel. Kyle smiled, telling Leonhardt to just wait and see. He released Flappy back to Ursel and with confidence assured Leonhardt that Abel would come looking for him soon. A few days later, in the Seltarian conference room, Rimtan addressed the gathered nobles. He announced that they would review the results of the expedition and decide on the distribution of the spoils. Additionally, they would discuss Kyle's contribution, which had been crucial in defeating the mutant ogre. He asked if anyone had objections. Adolf sat quietly, thinking that Rimtan had taught him well, knowing this would be an opportunity to persuade Kyle further. The others, however, were in disbelief at Kyle's contribution. Then someone spoke up, surprising Adolf. It was Baron Hemington. Hemington questioned whether it wasn't somewhat exaggerated. Kyle had played such a significant role in the expedition. Rimtan asked Hemington to clarify, and Hemington explained that while he understood Rimtan cherished his youngest son and wanted to promote him, Kyle was still only a first circle wizard, essentially an apprentice who had just begun learning magic. Hemington pointed out that considering Kyle's past behavior and the trouble he had caused, it seemed excessive to commend his achievements merely for participating in the expedition and returning alive. Hemington added that it was hard to believe Kyle could have matured overnight and suggested that everyone knew about the many troublesome incidents Kyle had caused in the past. He expressed his concern about what other accidents Kyle might cause in the future. Kyle smiled to himself, thinking that Hemington didn't hesitate to speak up because of the reckless reputation Kyle had built over the years. Calmly he addressed Hemington, telling him that one should experience fighting a mutant ogre in person before making any judgments. He added that it wasn't as easy as Hemington seemed to think, and perhaps Hemington would understand if he experienced it himself. Adolf was impressed by Kyle's reaction while Hemington fumbled trying to explain. Before he could continue, Abel intervened, calling Hemington's name seriously. Abel explained that even senior high-level knights would struggle to defeat an ogre, and fighting a mutant ogre which was more than twice as strong as a regular one and returning alive was nearly a miracle. Kyle was surprised that Abel had stepped in to defend him. Hemington, flustered, retorted that the knights had risked their lives to protect Kyle and that all 12 high-level knights except Kyle had died. However, Abel calmly responded that the decisive blow that killed the mutant ogre had been delivered by Kyle's magic, as confirmed by the testimonies of the surviving knights. He acknowledged that while Kyle had wandered a lot in his childhood, he had performed admirably on the expedition and was now focused on studying magic diligently. Abel urged Hemington to set aside any biases and recognize Kyle's achievements. Hemington attempted to argue further, but Adolf cut him off, shouting that it was enough. Adolf then asked if Hemington thought he had the right to criticize Kyle, the direct heir of the Marquis family, based on irrelevant past issues. Adolf also accused Hemington of overstepping his bounds. Hemington, clearly shaken, replied that he would never dare, now confused as to why even Adolf was stepping in to support Kyle. Kyle began to realize that everyone seemed eager to praise him. Adolf cleared his throat and told Remton that he agreed with Kyle's achievements and that Kyle should be properly evaluated, especially since the 5th Legion, which Adolf led, had testified that Kyle fought bravely. Remton then addressed everyone, stating that if both Abel and Adolf agreed on Kyle's contributions, there were no further objections. He declared that Kyle's probation would be officially lifted, granting him free access to the main residence and permission to go out. Kyle smiled happily at the news. However, Remton continued, announcing that the spoils of the mutant ogre would be distributed according to contributions and that Kyle would not receive any spoils, which took Kyle by surprise. Remton dismissed everyone, leaving Kyle confused, wondering why he hadn't received any spoils despite having his achievements recognized. Kyle quickly stopped his father and with a sweet tone asked if it was true that he wouldn't receive anything after going through all the trouble. Remton calmly asked in return if Kyle was lacking anything, and then in a whisper reminded Kyle that he had kept the ogre core. This revelation shocked Kyle, making him realize that Remton had caught on to his actions.